All right, so I had some interesting thoughts about essentially the sex drive and the shadow, and how essentially the sex drive and the shadow are sort of like best friends. Like a lot of the things that are connected to sexuality, human sexuality, end up being related to the shadow in some way, because the sex drive is very interesting in terms of how deeply it is sort of entwined with our various desires. And I've talked about uncoupling desires from each other so that we can allow ourselves to gain a greater awareness on specifically what it is that we're looking for in that area. And often what we do, because of culture and ethics and things that we're taught to believe that we must do, and values that we believe that we must assign to ourselves, what we end up doing is we connect things that we don't feel wholly good about as a desire on its own. We attach it to something else in order to make ourselves feel more like we're able to have a green light on going forward on a specific desire. But what we do is we sort of like say, okay, I want this thing, but in order to get this thing, I am supposed to want this other thing, and so sexuality is a hot sort of button for this particular phenomenon, because we're taught to be ashamed of sexuality, and that sexuality is like somehow something base and coarse, and yet it's such a powerful desire that sits at the root of desire itself. It's almost like it's coupled with like almost every other desire that we have as human beings. It somehow relates to sexuality, if you sort of follow the breadcrumbs enough to sort of have that recognition, to see like, okay, how is this, we're somehow sexuality is connected to this. Whatever desire there may be, often you'll find somehow sexuality itself is sort of not separate from desire itself. Because it's almost like sexuality is desire. It's almost like sexuality is the drive. There's a certain sex, the reason we want different things in life is because there's a certain sexiness about them, And so like if we want a car, like we want a nice car, but we don't just want a car because it's a car to, transport us to places for some abstract, reason. There's a certain, when we really want something, there's a certain sexual thrill that we get out of it. And, most people, they won't really recognize that because they have it delegated as something else, and they have like their sexuality delegated into some distinct thing that they only claim it as sexuality when it's like this overwhelming force to have, their sexual organs involved with another human being. But the truth is, sort of, desire itself is very closely related to how we experience sexuality. It's just like a matter of degrees. That is where the difference is. And so, if you go back to what it was like when you were a kid to want something, there was a certain, at least for me, when I wanted a toy or something, or I saw something cool on TV and I wanted it, there was a certain thrill to it that was not unlike the thrill of, seeing a beautiful woman would be for me, nowadays. And I think that is what it's sort of like, for most people. And, as we mature and we go through different phases, we want different things. But fundamentally, the mistake I think that people who get trapped by, egotistical forms of spirituality that try to be too pious is they try to cut off sexuality. And, the problem with that is sexuality is desire. And just like every other desire, the desire for spiritual fulfillment, there's a sexiness involved in achieving, greater states of consciousness. What is it that drives us to want to experience higher states of consciousness? There's a certain pull within us, and it draws us to something that is like, a numinous sort of state of experience. It's like there's something just beyond the veil and we want to experience it. And it's sort of like horniness, it's sort of like an attraction to the unknown, the way, someone, a man would be attracted to a woman. What is it that makes men and women attracted to each other? It's this sort of unknown quality that we want to give shape to, that we want to experience. We want to sort of like experience ourselves within a different realm, and we want to feel ourselves. We sort of want to feel our spirit. And so, when you sit down to meditate and you transcend, there is a desire force that is sort of like going through your spine, from your root chakra, your genitalia. And it's going, through the stomach, through the heart, through the spine, through the throat chakra. And, if you have like some issue with sexuality, then you're not going to get past, the root chakra, because you're creating an energy blockage and you're like trying to jump ahead. And now you are in some spiritual la-la land where you have a spiritual ego. But your fundamental self-awareness is standing apart from the very fact that the drive for greater states of awareness and enlightenment actually come from the root, from sexuality. Because desire and sexuality are very, very difficult to disentangle from one another. Now, there's a nuance here. Sexuality, I've said sexuality and desire are very closely related. Now, what is sexuality? Well, sexuality is not pure desire, essentially. It is, if we look at it from the point of view of someone who doesn't have an issue with sexuality, then it is pure desire. But what sexuality is, in terms of how we've been conditioned, is shame, a view of yourself, an unflattering view of yourself. It's an idea of lack. It's the idea that we have to do a complex set of things in order to become, sexually attractive to, whatever, the same gender or the opposite gender, whatever it is that you're into. And so sexuality is muddled and entangled with, how humans view themselves. But it would make sense that the thing that is connected to the desire force itself is the place where there's the hottest charges, And so to disentangle that, you kind of have to look, when you go to fulfill your desires, you kind of need to detach them from and separate them from each other to see each desire on its own. Fundamentally, they all go back down to the same root, but in order to really become a less complicated human being and to uncomplicate the circuitry in your body so that the energy can flow through you naturally, you have to look at, or I would recommend that you don't have to do anything, by the way, but I would recommend that you look at each desire that you have on an individual basis and try your best to not make fulfillment in one area contingent upon the fulfillment in another area. And so now I'm going to segue into first, how sexuality and the shadow are deeply connected to each other. So if I go back in time to my own time during puberty, I was a bit of a late bloomer, and on top of that, I was still learning English, and so my own focus was, I had so many things on my plate in terms of trying to learn how to socialize that sexuality and mating during my adolescence were, it was a very painful experience for me because I didn't really have the foundation to really explore that area of my life because I was still learning how to express myself in a foreign country where I didn't feel particularly welcomed or safe or comfortable, and my home life and circumstances were very challenging and scary a lot of the times. And so, to tackle I kind of stood away from, the whole mating scene. I mean, I did a little bit, I went to dances, I danced with girls, and, I've got a few kisses, but, I didn't do anything particularly serious, and I, didn't really feel equipped to tackle that subject. But what I remember was how, suddenly, the boys, my friends, how they would change, and how, it was an uncomfortable experience, because watching them, I could see how they became more, they became less reliable as friends, because now they've had, it's like suddenly, their instincts turn on, their sexual instincts, and now, like, you can't really rely on them for anything, because it doesn't matter, what they've told you that you've agreed to, but, now they're like out there, if they catch a whiff of some girl that they're interested in, now you can't really, depend on them. And so, things, get kind of weird during adolescence in, Western culture, because there's no real, it's not like really it's not really sanctioned. It's sort of, it sort of happens in the darkness. What we call sexual education isn't really sexual education. It's, it's, I don't know what it is. I don't want to go into it too much, but it's not particularly helpful. And so, like, what children who reach adolescence go through is they're kind of like in the dark, sort of figuring out who they are as this sexual person, but no one really, like, there's no real, like, coming of age or, rite of passage, that interfaces with the rest of society. It's just something that's just sort of, happens in sort of in the shadow, in the darkness. And, I think that's where you end up with a lot of problems, with STDs and teenage pregnancies and all these things, and, broken hearts, and just a lot of chaos. So, yeah, I remember the chaos of adolescence. And what I saw was, looking back at it, sexuality, is so much connected to desires. My head was getting warm, so I took off my hat. The adolescent phase, suddenly you could feel this, or I could feel this sort of, like I, entered like some kind of boiler room where there's like a lot of heat, in the atmosphere. And, the vibrations are sort of heavy and thick, and everyone's sort of longing and, sort of in their heads. And, boys begin sulking, and girls, begin sulking, and, like fights occur because, one guy wants the same girl as another guy, or, vice versa, two girls fight each other because over some boy or something. And so it's sort of creepy, it's like, because there's no real actual guidance by anyone, because you're not really supposed to interface with, the younger generation about this subject too directly. It was like, everyone was just kind of like, just like, just becoming like these, sort of like these animals. And, I don't think, ever anything ever got, fully resolved, and, people, the teenagers didn't really, I think most teenagers, they sort of go through this phase. It's awkward and embarrassing for them. Then they become young adults, and they never really learn the lessons on how to deal with this. They just sort of delegate it somewhere into the background where it's like some uncomfortable memory for them. But it's still, essentially, they're still, they still haven't really fully matured. They've put their attention on something else. But, sexually, they're still kind of, most people are, when they sort of push it down. And then you watch people as they get older, and they don't really get much wiser, on the subject of sexuality. I mean, they just get more cunning on how to do it in, behind closed doors, and, a lot of like the creepiness, it's happening all around us, and no one, like, we sort of look the other way, but, we can sort of feel it, going on. So, my point that I'm trying to make here is, sexuality is connected to the shadow, because the shadow is, where we experience a lot of our desires that we're not proud of and we don't own. And it's often through sexuality that we express our shadow. So our desire for mating and sex often is also the desire to, like, get into fights, get into conflicts, assert dominance over others, perpetuate, arguments, and perpetuate ideas that are like defeating of ourselves, our self-esteem, and to undercut ourselves and others with, limiting beliefs. And we feel okay to do it because we don't, you can always tell, we're always more polite to our platonic friends quite often than we are to our romantic interests. Our romantic interest, our romantic partner is sort of where we, not only take off our clothes literally, but sort of, emotionally we take off our clothes in a way that I think we do it a little bit too mindlessly and unconsciously, in terms of like how, with the kind of disrespect that we give to other people, because we're sort of like in an intimate relationship with them. We feel it's okay to abuse them in all sorts of ways, and we sort of take abuse that we really shouldn't take. And so intimacy is an interesting word here, because intimacy doesn't just always mean love is happening. We can be very intimately hateful. Our hatred we can be intimately connected to our own hatred and someone else's hatred in a romantic relationship. Where It's like we say we have a love-hate relationship with them. But, often what is keeping us in relationships that are unhealthy, from a certain point of view, they're unhealthy. Maybe from a more macroscopic point of view, they're sort of necessary for our development as a human being, and perhaps it's unavoidable. But, when you, from a closer point of view, it's unhealthy because we allow ourselves to be, unhinged, emotionally unhinged in the realm of sexuality, because we feel these emotions and our passions get a hold of us, and before you know it, what comes out of our mouths is, oh, they made me do it. They're making me do it. Why are they always trying to make me take the high road? Why do I have to take the high road? Why don't they take the high road? And it's because we become blinded, to the autonomy of others when we enter into romantic relationships. And this is sort of, where desires are coupled, where, it's like on the face of it, you're wanting to have someone who's a romantic partner, someone to explore your sexuality with. But the truth, the more deeper desire is to like play out some kind of fucked up like game, something about power, something about dominance, something about feeling insecure and weak, that you sort of need to have this pretense of having a romantic sexual partner with in order to be able to allow yourself to relax enough into the darker part of yourself to, allow yourself to explore those desires, which are real desires, the desire for cruelty, the desire for envy, the desire for, destructiveness. These are all in us, this too, is what it means to be a human being, and you can say you're above this, but the instinct for these things are there. They're real. They're just as real as all the magnanimous, altruistic kindness and compassion. All of those are real too. But, hatefulness, destructiveness, selfishness, and cruelty and envy and wrath, these are very much to what it means to be human. So, with regard to sexuality, I would recommend that people take a closer look at sexuality itself to see what it is that they want out of merely the sex drive, and to see if they can find some way of exploring that desire on its own, apart from relationship desire, and then be mindful of the other components, the darker desires. Identify those, find them in yourself, and find them as separate things from all the other things that you have attached to them, and see if there's some way you can find fulfillment in these darker parts of your nature without manipulating someone into a false pretense to have a relationship with you where it's under the guise of one thing, but really it's the desire for chaos and destruction inside of yourself that you're not real, that you've got coupled to, relationship, to sexuality, to romanticism. And if there is some other creative way, perhaps, on finding fulfillment, cooking those seeds of desire within yourself so that you can move past them. Acknowledge that they are part of who you are, that they are part of not just what you are, but what it means to be human. And then not be so bothered, about them, I always like this quote from, I believe it's called Point of No Return, was a movie. And this woman is being trained to be an assassin. And by the older lady who's training her, she's training her how to be like a polite, high-class woman. And she tells her, to say, I never did mind about the little things. Learn how to not mind about the little things of what it means to be a human. The chaos, the destructiveness, the lust, the joy. These are all, the compassion, the empathy, the altruism. These are all, they're all things. They're all components, but they're really, they're important, but also they're not as important as we try to make them. Because by trying to make them more important than what each of these components really are, we convolute them and we make them, we attach things to them that aren't really meant to be attached to them. So, when we hold things on a pedestal, even virtuous things, what we end up creating, for example, in the Catholic Church, which is a good example. I'm sorry, Catholics, for picking on you. I know they're good Catholics, but, in the Catholic Church, you have, this element of piousness. And in other, spiritualities, you have this element of piousness and, abstinence, from sexuality. And I'm trying to find the more correct term, but essentially what it creates, this sort of form of monasticism, for people who aren't ready to take those vows, what you end up with is priests who end up, abusing little altar boys, essentially, So that's, when you have somebody who's preaching, celibacy is the word I was looking for. If you have spiritual people who are preaching celibacy, but they're not taking into account that not everybody is ready for that, and not everybody should be celibate, what you end up is creating monks who, abuse little children behind closed doors and underneath, systems of authority that are, abuses of power. And so, the spiritual path is just like any other thing. It is filled with, Maya being the illusion of the world, and it's filled with samsara, the illusion of the world. It's filled with Mara, the god of death. It is filled with the ego. So all things that are external, including spirituality, and any, and gurus, monks, sages, until you find the guru within yourself, you're always going to be subject to samsara, the world illusion. The guru is always going to be an illusion of the guru. And until you find the true guru, which is within yourself, within what you experience, within what you think, within what you feel, within the truth that lives inside of you, and really realize you can make yourself miserable in this world, you can make yourself happy in this world, And you can be okay, miserable or happy and how you feel about things is largely based upon how you respond to whatever it is that the illusion of the world throws at you. And if you realize that fundamentally what you are is an observer who's been here since the beginning of time, and all of this is merely a very diverse and complex theater, then you become more, that's where you find real freedom, in the realization you can be at peace, because what you are essentially is an observer. You're the being that is observing this story that you call yourself. You call it yourself, but really, what is yourself? It's a story. It's a story that other people told you. You took parts of their story, you agreed with it, then you put it in your own head. You've had these experiences and you relate your sense of self to that, and then you say, this is who I am, this is where I've been, this is what I've done, this is what I've achieved. These are the things that are important to me. But if you can learn to, you don't have to completely discard all that, but just acknowledge that is not really the source of what you are. That is merely the character, that you've witnessed. And then something interesting happened to me, I don't know, a few days ago I've had this experience, but I've had this experience before. It's almost like I felt a fondness for this character, this person who online I've named Ratam. This person, Ratam, and his life story. I felt, this body. I felt compassion and empathy for him as an observer of who he was. But who he was is merely a very pliable and agreeable skin for me to wear, essentially. And so I felt love for this, this character, like I feel love for other people, because it's like I am just as much him as I am anyone else. And I can see his struggles and his thoughts and his despair and his dark moments, and I even experience them as from the first person point of view through the lenses of this body. But I am just as much, that is just as much a story as anyone else's story. What this, this character Ratam has experienced in his life belongs to me the same amount as whatever story, you happen to be going through, or anyone else is happening to be going through. I may not be aware of the details as this being, but fundamentally what this being experiences in principle is universal to all those who experience. It's sort of like how every snowflake is different, but there's a sort of fundamental pattern that creates how the crystals materialize. And it's like in nature, like you see certain shapes reoccurring, because these are the principle behind how things manifest, And I like this one guy who's talks about the habits of nature. It's like once nature has done it once, is more likely to repeat it in the same pattern. So like if it's hasn't like rained in some place for a long time, it might, you know, it might be more difficult to sort of manifest water in that place, because it's sort of nature is not really used to manifesting water in that specific place. So anyhow, I've covered a lot of subjects here. The main points that I wanted to make is how sexuality is connected to all these other desires that we keep in the shadow, but we sort of use sexuality. We call it sexuality, but really what it is, it's the, you know, it's the manifestation drive, it's the desire drive, it's the drive for everything. It's the desire for creativity, it's the desire for destructiveness, and you know that comes from a certain feeling of sexiness and attractiveness and beauty and longing, and that all sort of comes from, you know, what I would say when we uncomplicated it, you know, it would be accurately described as the sex drive. But because we have so many notions about sexuality, you know, perhaps it would be more suitable to call it, you know, like the creative, fundamental life force drive. But either way, it works. So anyhow, I just wanted to like sort of jot these thoughts down, put them together, you know, keep them, you know, speak them out loud, record them, see how my brain processes them. You know, it's a sort of, you know, all of this is sort of me teaching myself, expressing my experiences, trying to be as truthful as I can be and descriptive as possible about my things that I have discovered and learned. And you know, what I'm learning is always subject to change and upgrade, and you know, I'm always finding new words to describe my experiences, and yeah, it's fun for me. So anyway, hope you guys enjoyed this. Have a good one.